Good evening, everyone. Welcome. First of all, thank you so much to Congregation Abbas Achim, especially Rabbi Stephen Neodownik, President Josh Ostrin for hosting this event. And thank you, of course, to Mark Abraham for all his work organizing the Orthodox Forum series this year. Can you all hear me? So just quickly, my name is Rivka, and it's an honor for me to be introducing our guest speaker for this evening, which is the first event in the Orthodox Forum series for this season. Dr. Rivka Schwartz serves as Associate Principal of General Studies at the SAR High School, as co-director of the Machon Siach Research Institute at SAR, and as a fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America. Dr. Schwartz earned a PhD in the history of science from Princeton University, writing her dissertation about the cultural history of the Manhattan Project. She spent 20 years in Orthodox high school education, the last 15 of them in modern Orthodox co-ed high schools, and has served as an adjunct professor of history at Yeshiva and Stern colleges. In the past several years, Dr. Schwartz has emerged as one of the most important voices in discussions pertaining to modern Orthodoxy in the United States, lecturing and publishing in a wide range of venues about urgent issues such as education, our responsibility to and relationship with our neighbors, and the nature of our obligations as Torah-commanded Jews in the modern world. Tonight, Dr. Schwartz will be speaking on the subject of race, class, and American modern Orthodox life. Following the talk, she'll take questions. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Rivka Schwartz.
Shavua Tov, good Tov. Thank you, Rebecca. Driving down the turnpike and then getting off at exit 9 to 18 and 1, I was having flashbacks to the many times I made that drive when I was going back to graduate school from my apartment in Washington Heights. So nice to be here. We're here to talk tonight about a challenging topic to discuss within our community, which is the question of race primarily and class as well, and how we as an American modern Orthodox community relate to that conversation. And most of what I want to talk about tonight is why that conversation is challenging or difficult for us to have. What is it about our own lives, experiences, community story that makes this conversation a difficult one for us to come into? I am not, by and large, going to engage in the contemporary political debates, the of the moment political debates around this issue. Although if there are people here who would like to engage those during the Q&A, we can do so as well. I really want to talk about our history, but primarily our stories as a community, and why our own experience and our own stories can get in the way of our knowing or hearing other people's stories. Before I do any of that, I want to start with an important introduction, which is to say that I'm going to be speaking largely about an Ashkenazi European origin American Jewish story. Not all American Jews are Ashkenazim of European origin. However, the most recent Pew study about the American Jewish population confirms with data what we kind of know anecdotally, which is that is still the overwhelming majority of the American Jewish population. And so when we talk about our American Jewish stories, while we have to certainly be aware of and conscious of the existence of American Jewish populations whose origins are in places other than Europe, as well as the presence of Jews of color in our communities, and those two categories are not the same and overlapping, right? There are Jews of color who are Ashkenazi Jews. There are Jews from origin outside of Europe who might not, by the American schema, count as Jews of color. So it's important to know that those are complicatedly interrelated categories. So I think it's important to realize that the stories I'm going to be talking about are not the stories of all American Jews, but they are still the stories of the majority of American Jews. And I think they shape the stories of our community and the way we interact with these complicated and challenging topics. And so that is the experience I am primarily going to be talking about and addressing myself to tonight. And so to start by talking about our American Jewish stories and what's challenging about those stories, I'm actually going to talk about my family's story. So if you'll give me a few minutes of your time to listen to what I promise you is about a bigger point than just my grandfather's story, I'm going to tell you a little bit about my grandfather's story. My maternal grandfather, whose name when he left Poland was Yehuda Kuprinsky, came to the United States of America. I would have said sometime in the 20s or 30s, but actually my daughter, who's a high school senior, is now in the middle of doing an extensive genealogy research project. And she messaged me excitedly last week when she found his name on the ship manifest of the ship that came here in 1928. So I now know that my maternal grandfather came here in 1928. He would have been a boy of about 7 or 8 years old. It's actually pretty remarkable because in 1924, the United States passed a piece of legislation meant to decrease the number of undesirable immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, like my grandparents and great-grandparents. And so the quotas were decreased, and it was very hard to get a visa to come in to the community, to come into the United States from Poland. Somehow my grandparents managed it. Not sure what's going on here. We seem to be getting feedback from the Zoom. Somehow my grandfather managed it and came here in 1928. By the way, by the time he came into the country, his name was Yehuda Cooper and then Julius Cooper. For years, I believed and recounted the myth that his name was changed at Ellis Island. It was only in the recent past couple of years that I have learned that nobody's name was changed at Ellis Island. Lo haya v'lo nivra, that's not a thing that happened. Names were not changed at Ellis Island. If you have a family story, as I did, of your name being changed at Ellis Island, I am here to tell you what I had to learn, which is that someone in your family changed their name in a conscious choice to sound more American or more acculturated. And it was easier to blame that on the inspector at Ellis Island than to own that choice. The Julius part is, of course, funny because, you know, to my grandfather or to his father, Julius sounded like a very American name. To us, of course, Julius sounds like an old Jewish man who's an immigrant from Poland. But Julius Cooper, my grandfather served as a GI in the American Army in World War II. He was a frum man. He was an Orthodox observant man all the way through. I can't even wrap my brain around the experience of what it must have been like to be an immigrant from Poland in the United States, in the American Army, shipped back over to Europe to fight in World War II. He married my grandmother in between basic training and shipping out, and then proceeded not to see her for years. When he came back, they started a family. My mother was born in March of 1946, a true baby boomer. My grandfather sort of flailed around looking for a way to make a living. He tried a number of different things. He became a shochet. He tried selling things. And eventually, my grandfather found himself in the real estate business. And he began buying apartment buildings with small, cheap apartments that were taken up by starving artists, by, you know, lonely old men dependent on alcohol, by poor people who couldn't find any other place to live. And he bought up these apartment buildings in this poor and rundown neighborhood in Brooklyn called Williamsburg. Those are the apartment buildings that my mother and her siblings still own. That real estate purchase from half a century and more ago is the source of what academics call an intergenerational transfer of wealth from my grandfather to my parents, and presumably eventually one day to us. That's our story. Every word of that story is true. It is a story that we take pride in. It is a story of having been the victims of discrimination, anti-Semitism, and hate in Eastern Europe, and coming to the United States, where if things were not perfect, they were certainly vastly, enormously much better, where economic opportunity was real, where with education and hard work, you could build and accumulate and pass on. And if that's your family story, and it's a true story, and it's your family's experience, when you look around this country at other communities that haven't done the same building and accumulating and passing on, you can very reasonably say, why didn't they? Why haven't they? Why haven't they taken advantage of the opportunities that were afforded to them in America the same way they were afforded to me and my family in America? My grandfather came here with nothing. He could do it. It must be, and then we fill in all the it must be's. Why these individuals or communities must be at fault for their own lack of success, why it must reflect their lack of hard work or effort or investment. And so one reason I think why we as an American Jewish community have difficulty engaging, understanding with others' experience in America is because our stories, the truth that we lived and we experienced, get in our way of hearing or understanding other people's stories, other people's truths, other people's lived experiences. So now I want to tell you some other things that are also true. Here's something else that's also true. In the 1930s, in the middle of the Great Depression, Franklin Delano Roosevelt is elected president of the United States. He comes in not with a well-developed ideology of government, but just a throw everything to the wall and see what sticks approach. We don't know how to break the Great Depression that the country has already been in the grips of for years. We're going to try everything. Every program, every expenditure, every investment. But here is a truth about the Democratic Party coalition in the 1930s that FDR needs behind him to pass his legislation. It is a collection of strange bedfellows. Because yes, he has in his coalition those who find themselves on the political pretty far left, wanting strong government action and a lot of government spending to break the back of this depression. Workers in the cities, the labor movement, again, various members of the political left, they are all Democrats. Here's who's also Democrats in the 1930s. The white supremacists of the Solid South are all Democrats. Now, they're all Democrats for a simple, if somewhat strange reason. Abraham Lincoln was a Republican. In fact, he was the first Republican president. And so the solid white South votes Democratic, basically from the end of Reconstruction until 1964. 100 years almost. Votes for Democrats. But here in the 1930s is FDR wanting to do something a little different, wanting to spend a ton of money, wanting to start a lot of government programs, and he needs the votes of those Southern senators and representatives to get his legislation passed. And so a deal is struck. And the deal is very simple. We will back your bills if you do your darndest to make sure that Black people don't benefit from them. Those are the terms of the deal. Social Security Act is passed in 1935. Social Security Act is an old age pension system for elderly Americans. When I teach my students about this every year, I always tell them that Social Security was created because in the middle of the Great Depression, right? Grandma was stuck eating cat food. We don't want grandma stuck eating cat food, Social Security. The Social Security Act, as passed in 1935, excluded two classes of workers from its benefits. It excluded agricultural workers from its benefits, and it excluded domestic workers from its benefits. People who worked on farms and people who worked in other people's homes as cooks, nannies, maids, laundresses were excluded from the benefits of the Social Security Act. This was not a coincidence, and it was not an accident. They were the two lines of employment in which the majority of African Americans worked. Since the ratification of the 14th Amendment after the Civil War, you could not have legislation that explicitly discriminated on the basis of race. That's not allowed in the United States anymore. But if you're creative and you're determined, you can write legislation that discriminates on the basis of race without saying that it discriminates on the basis of race. Like, for example, you can pass a Social Security Act that grants benefits to elderly Americans if they have worked and paid into the system, but not if they worked in the agricultural and domestic service sectors. My grandfather served in World War II. The United States government, cognizant of its obligations, of its responsibilities to those people who had served the country, passed something that has an official name but got known unofficially to everybody as the GI Bill. The GI Bill was our country making good on its obligations to men who had served this country in World War II. The two most important benefits of the GI Bill were education and housing. Education, the federal government would pay for you to get a post-secondary education. And housing, the federal government would back a mortgage loan so that these GI Bills would be better credit risks for banks to lend to, and they will be able to get mortgages and buy their own homes. To explain how this worked in practice, I go to that very important and scholarly source, the Disney movie Cinderella. I cite this scene all the time. It is really useful for illuminating a lot of things, but one of the things that's really useful for illuminating is the GI Bill. The letter from the prince comes to the Cinderella home, calling all eligible maidens to come to the ball. The stepmother and the two stepsisters, whom Disney names Drizella and Anastasia, are planning how they will go to the ball to win over the prince. Cinderella comes bounding eagerly into the room. Stepmother, the invitation says all maidens. Shouldn't I too be able to go to the ball? The stepmother smiles slyly, because that's what she does. And she says, yes, Cinderella, if you finish your work and if you find a dress, then you can go to the ball. And Cinderella happily skips out of the room, and Drizella and Anastasia are aghast. Mother, what did you say to her? And she gives another cunning smile, and she says, if. I said if. If you could find a university to accept you, the federal government would pay your tuition. In 1945, many American universities, including all the state schools in the South, were Jim Crow and would not accept Black students. And the few historically Black colleges or Black state schools that there were didn't have enough seats for all the Black GIs who wanted them. And so there were returning African-American soldiers who could not enjoy the benefits of the GI Bill, even though they were promised it by their country for their service, because they couldn't find a college that would accept them. The promise of backing a mortgage loan still required that you find a private bank that was willing to lend to you and a realtor who was willing to sell you a home. And given a racist system for classifying neighborhoods as good to poor credit risks, which had been established by the federal government in the 1930s, as well as the actions of banks, which then directed their loans based on those maps, Black GIs couldn't find a private bank to lend to them for the federal government to back the loan. If, I said if. And so, as the real estate boom of the post-World War II years becomes the single largest engine of wealth creation ever seen in American history, and as millions of American men who served in World War II are given the opportunity to buy into that engine of wealth creation, African-American GIs are systematically excluded from it by government action. This is not political positioning. This is not an argument. This is very well established historical fact. For the discussion of both the GI Bill and Social Security, you can read Ira Katznelson's book, When Affirmative Action Was White. For discussion of real estate and lending, the best book out there is Richard Rothstein's book, The Color of Law, although there are many, many other books that deal with it as well. At this point, I have a whole bookshelf of these stories of home ownership, inclusion and exclusion and white flight and suburbanization. So I've got 2 books on Detroit and 2 books on Baltimore and 1 book on San Francisco and a book and a long article on Chicago. And at some point, you don't need to read a separate book about every single metropolitan area in the United States to realize that this national policy and its local enactments played out the same way all over the country. So my grandfather's story, which is absolutely true, every word of it, and the pride that we take in what he was able to accomplish, and the enormous gratitude that he felt towards this country for being the place that gave him the opportunity to accomplish it. Every word of that in its truth keeps me from seeing and hearing someone else's truth, because it is so wildly different from my experience and my history that it almost does not compute. Before I tell you the story about does not compute, since it's the week of Thanksgiving, I'll just tell you that although I grew up in a right-wing Orthodox community where celebrating Thanksgiving is not something that's necessarily done, and in fact, celebrating Thanksgiving is regarded in some circles as halakhically problematic, my grandfather was insistent that we celebrate Thanksgiving. He was profoundly grateful to the United States of America for what it had afforded him. The promises of the Declaration of Independence were very real to him. Had he stayed in Poland in 1928, he would not have had the pursuit of happiness, and he would not have had liberty, and he would not have had life. And so it was very real to him that this was what the United States gave him and afforded him. And by golly, all the years that he was alive, we had to celebrate Thanksgiving. We had to get together as a family and do Thanksgiving, because for him, that was how he expressed or acted out his gratitude towards this country. But now I want to tell you one story about does not compute, among many that I could tell you. There's a great quote from James Baldwin that I should have looked up before I came here, where he says that American history is more beautiful and more terrible, and he uses a few more adjectives than anything we could ever say about it. We don't always learn the more terrible. There are a lot of reasons why we don't. We don't always talk about the more terrible. There's a lot of more terrible that we could talk about. I want to pick one episode. I want to pick one episode because it actually happens the same decade that my grandfather comes to the United States. And I want to pick one episode because I taught this in a class to 12th grade students, and a student pretty much accused me of lying to him in front of the class because he could not believe that something like this would happen in the United States. Because when we know our stories and our truths, a story like this just does not compute. And it's the story of the Tulsa Race Massacre. Now, it used to be that when I taught about the Tulsa Race Massacre altogether, again, I had a student 2 years ago accuse me of making it up. Between the 100th anniversary, which happened this year, 2021 is the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa Race Massacre, and the television show The Watchmen, which apparently includes the Tulsa Race Massacre as a plot line, there are now more people that are familiar with it. But I think it's worth spending the time on to talk about. In Tulsa, Oklahoma, there was a wealthy Black business district. The Greenwood district was known as the Black Wall Street. African Americans had built impressive and stately homes. They owned businesses. They were accumulating wealth. On a pretextual basis, it's always a pretextual basis, right? The accusations that you did something to provoke the pogrom is always a pretext. The white community in Tulsa in 1921, unleashed its rage on the Black business district of Greenwood. They destroyed every business. They burnt it to the ground. They killed hundreds of African Americans who were buried in mass graves in Tulsa. They ran many of the others out of town. A number of years ago, eyewitness testimony of the Tulsa Race Massacre was discovered, and it's now in the Smithsonian's Museum of African American History and Culture. I remember where I was when I saw the article giving us this testimony, because it is mind-blowing and unbelievable, but also true. A lawyer who happened to be the father of John Hope Franklin, who was one of the very, very famous and prominent African-American historians in the 20th century United States, was a witness to the Tulsa Race Massacre. And he described seeing airplanes flying over the Greenwood district, dropping incendiary, some kind of burning substance from the air onto the buildings to burn them from the top down. In other words, the authorities in Tulsa were firebombing their own Black citizens. This is 1921. Do you remember what year Kitty Hawk was? It's one of the first recorded instances of aerial bombardment in human history. And it's done by the local authorities in Tulsa against their own Black citizens. We know what to call it when marauders come through a community, burn the buildings down, murder, rape, rob, destroy. We call it a pogrom. The reason why my great-grandparents and probably your great-grandparents and most of our great-grandparents didn't accumulate wealth in Eastern Europe is because whenever they tried, somebody showed up and stole it or burned it down. For us, the United States is the land of my grandfather's story. It's the place where finally that wasn't going to happen. We were going to be safe and secure, not perfect, but safe and secure. And we were going to be able to build, accumulate, and pass on wealth. I cannot compute when you tell me that this same country that my family came to escape pogroms was inflicting them on somebody else. And so I had a student in class who basically said to me, I think you're lying to us. I don't think this ever happened. And then, because it's the wonderful world of Wi-Fi and Google, he starts looking it up in class while I'm teaching. And then his jaw drops. This really happened. This is the thing that actually happened. Yes, it is the thing that actually happened. Why didn't they tell us about this in school? Honey, you're sitting in school and I'm telling you about it. You're right, it's not part of the 11th grade history curriculum. That's like a great question and a very loaded and complicated topic today, right? How do we teach about American history? But you're right, you didn't learn it in your 11th grade history curriculum. Here we are in 12th grade, I'm teaching it to you. I could talk at much greater length about these other stories. There is a great deal of history in the United States of America, which again, we do not know. We don't think about. Maybe I'll talk about one more thing just because I think it's important to realize that there is this large history. And you can say we slotted in, right? If my grandfather came here in 1928, I came here, or at least some parts of my family came here. After a fair amount of this history had already happened. Maybe it makes sense we don't know about it. We weren't here when it was going on. But if we are living in the country that was created and shaped by this history, at some point we have to learn and know about it. So I'll tell you about one other thing. The number of examples that we could talk about is pretty much endless. But I'll talk about one other thing because the idea that there are some people that the law binds whom it does not protect, and some people whom the law protects that it does not bind, is essential to understanding the history of race in the United States. So I want to talk a little bit about lynching. First of all, lynching doesn't mean hanging, I tell my students. Lynching means extrajudicial killing, killing outside the frameworks of the law. Lynchings were very often hangings, but they weren't exclusively hangings. Second of all, lynchings were not local and accidental and occasional. Lynchings were part of a broad strategy of terrorizing the population. The Equal Justice Initiative has documented at least 3,000 lynchings in the United States. And that's the number they've documented that they have definitive evidence of. Number three, perhaps the greatest myth about lynching is that they happened under cover of night in darkness. No one ever knew who did them. In fact, that was so widely said in newspaper stories about lynching that Philip Dray, in his book about lynching, titles his book "At the Hands of Persons Unknown." Right? So-and-so was taken and killed at the hands of persons unknown. We know that isn't true because lynchings were often documented in photographs. Photographs that were sometimes turned into postcards or souvenirs or sent around. There's an online exhibit called Without Sanctuary, Lynching Photography in America. You can go to it, withoutsanctuary.org, and you can look at and you can see. Some years I show these to my students because I think they have to see them. Some years I decide they're too disturbing and I don't. But one of the things you see in many of the lynching photographs is crowds, mass spectacle. Bring your whole community and watch a lynching. Of all the many pictures Without Sanctuary, the one in particular that stays with me is a picture from a lynching in Florida in the 1930s. And in the foreground of the picture, you have the corpse of the lynching victim. And behind him, you have three white girls. And I think the reason the picture stuck with me so much is because when I started my teaching career, a longish time ago. In the early 2000s, it was still totally possible that those white girls were grandmothers somewhere in Florida, that those women who had been young children, who had come to see the fun spectacle of a lynching, were still alive, voting in this country we live in. That's how not far away it is. That's true. My grandfather's story is also true. And it can be so hard to resolve those into one picture or one understanding of the country that maybe we just don't hear or appreciate or understand those stories. How do I make sense of the profoundness of my family's appreciation and gratitude to this country and what it's afforded us, and understand how profoundly it meant something else to other people and to other families and to other communities? But I don't think that's everything. And I think there's at least one other thing that we must talk about if we are going to talk about the difficulty and the challenge that we as a community have in contending with this topic. And it is this. Implicit in what I've just told you about my grandfather's story first, and then the history of the GI Bill second, is to say that when my grandfather came to this country, he acceded to whiteness. He was handed, you are white. You may not have known this. You may not speak English, but in this country, we sort people by white and black. And we have decided that you're white and you get the benefits of whiteness. And there are two separate reasons why I think that that is very difficult for us to think about and contend with, and I'd like to address them separately. Here is the first one. My grandfather worked really, really hard. He worked hard his entire life. He worked hard until he died. He was not somehow handed some bank account or some assets or some wealth or some whatever it was. He worked to accumulate it. When I hear the GI Bill granted him these benefits, I don't know, kind of sounds to me like you're saying my grandfather didn't work for it. He didn't accomplish it. He didn't try. It was just given to him. That's so not true. And if it's not true about my grandfather who came here as a poor immigrant, Kal v'chomer, it's not true about those people whose parents or grandparents came here as Holocaust survivors. Deeply traumatized, without family, having nothing. Does not this story take away from them the credit for what they did, for what they accomplished, for what they built? So I actually think, I don't usually do this, but occasionally, in talking about race in America, it's worth invoking some words of Torah. And it's worth invoking some words of Torah, not because they speak directly to this circumstance, but because they speak to a parallel set of circumstances. In Devarim, Moshe is talking to the Jewish people about to enter Eretz Yisrael, and he is warning them against achieving financial success, accumulating wealth, and then making the error of thinking that that my strength and the might of my arm has accumulated this wealth for me. And he says to them, do not forget Hashem, your God. For Hashem is the one who gives you the strength to accumulate this wealth. Yes, you have done. You have built, you have accomplished, but someone else created the framework, setting, context in which this accomplishing can happen. I am not comparing the GI Bill to God, just to be perfectly clear. I am only saying that we have frameworks within our Torah sources to think about the idea that we can both take well-earned pride in our accomplishments and also recognize that we did not do them on their own or get there on our own, that other people or beings or situations may have created the circumstances in which we could accomplish, and to be able to acknowledge that even as we take pride in those accomplishments. This is not a binary. Either my grandfather worked hard or he reaped what Rhoda Gerder's book calls the wages of whiteness. It can be both. I've often in this context said that we have to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. We have to be able to hold both of those ideas. My grandfather worked very hard for everything that he built and created, but also there were laws, frameworks, systems in place that enabled his hard work to pay off in ways that other people's hard work could not. And that doesn't take anything away from my grandfather, doesn't take anything away from generations of Jewish immigrants who came and strived and pursued education for their children and built and saved and passed on, to also know that they did that in a context that leveraged their hard work, that advanced their hard work, that allowed their hard work to accomplish more than someone else's hard work. So I think it's not just that my story and this other story don't fit together. I also think that it even feels like this other story is taking something away from my story. And if there's one thing I would like to communicate to our community about this, it is that to know these truths and to take in these truths and to assimilate these truths does not take away anything from what the generations that came before us built and accomplished. They did, they built and accomplished. But it helps us understand that other communities were not given the same opportunity to build and accomplish in the same way. But there's a third thing that I have to address myself to. A harder, a tougher thing. A painful thing. And that is even in the United States, as good as things have been, as welcoming as things have been, as accommodating as things have been, and the history of Jewish diaspora, there has not been a galut as welcoming, as accommodating as everything else as the United States of America. Even with all of that, things are very far from perfect. And for many of us, it feels like things have gotten significantly farther from perfect in the past number of years. And it is therefore very hard to hear a conversation or an approach to thinking about these issues that asks us to think of ourselves and our parents and our grandparents as inheritors of some sort of advantage in American society, when we right now are living in a country in which our shuls and our schools have ever increasing armed presences around them, in which Jews have been attacked for being visibly Jewish in Times Square and in Los Angeles, in which we watched young men carrying torches march through an American city chanting, "Jews will not replace us," in which a shul in Pittsburgh was shot up during davening on Shabbos morning. And all of us feel that sense of vulnerability and maybe even fear in a way that I have to tell you, as a kid growing up in New York City in the 1980s, I did not feel. I remember at some point seeing images of European shuls with armed guards outside them and thinking, that's insane. How do people live that way with armed guards outside their shuls? I walk into my school building every day through the gate that closes and locks, past the guard with a gun, wearing my ID so everybody knows I belong there. And on that Motzei Shabbat in August of 2017, we had been away for Shabbos. I was driving home, we were in the car, and I turned the radio on, and I heard what was going on in the world and what they were talking about Charlottesville, and I turned the radio off because I didn't want to scare my children. The first time I can remember as an American feeling like letting my children know what was going on in this country was going to be scary to them, and turned off the radio. So in that context, and that reality, and that is also true, it can be very, very hard to hear somebody say to you, there is a racial schema in this country, and there are advantages to whiteness, and the most of American Jews who are of European and Ashkenazi background, we code as white. My grandfather got the GI Bill. However, they liked him in the army because he was Jewish. They didn't like him in the army because he was Jewish. He had stories to tell. At the end of the day, when the GI Bill benefits were being handed out that way, he was eligible for them, and Black GIs who served couldn't get them. I mean, technically they could get them, if. I said if. And so I think some of us say this story simply cannot be true because it does not speak to our lived experience. to our anxiety, maybe to our fear. Because to tell me that seems to be erasing my lived experience and my family and my community's lived experience, and all the ways in which I still feel like a member of a visible minority, and I still worry about how, as a member of a visible minority, I may be targeted just going about my life, certainly going to my shul or my school in the United States of America in 2021. And again, I think this calls for us to realize that there is complexity here, that this is not a simple yes or no. Just like it's not a simple, my grandfather worked hard or he didn't work hard and he was handed everything on a silver platter. That's not the answer here. It's not a simple yes or no. We are vulnerable to anti-Semitism. And the most of us who are Ashkenazi Jews of European background have the benefits that the United States of America conferred upon people that it labeled as white. Both of those things can be true. Both of those things can be true at the same time. Sometimes I've had students tell me that they do not consider themselves white. As Jews, they don't think of themselves as white. I struggle with that as a history teacher because, again, when it came to the GI Bill, and so I've started to use the term white enough. We're white enough. When the cop pulls me over, I'm white enough. I've had interactions with police officers that I know I would not have had if my skin color were different. They would have gone down differently. And so it can both be true that I walk into school, past the locked gate and the armed guard, wearing the ID, none of which was there when I started working there in 2005. And it can also be true that in certain interactions with the criminal legal system and in other ways, to say nothing of the history that we've talked about here, the history of housing benefits, the history of GI Bill benefits, the history of other things, that American Jews were white enough. Even if it's also true that at the same time that my grandfather was eligible for GI Bill benefits, that Ivy League universities still had quotas on the number of Jews they would admit. It does not require denying the one to acknowledge the other. We can hold both things. And so I think when we, as a community, as an American Modern Orthodox community, think about our story and this other American story, rather than shutting down, if your story is true, it makes it impossible for mine to be. If this recounting is true, then I can't be proud of my grandfather. If what you say is true, then we've been handed everything on a silver platter and we haven't worked hard. If what you say is true, then you deny the reality of anti-Semitism or the fear that I face. I think instead of closing ourselves off that way, because our stories are different and maybe even seem incompatible, as a community, it is incumbent on us to realize our stories and our experiences are true. They're absolutely true, except for the part of my grandfather's name getting changed at Ellis Island. That wasn't true. The rest of his story is true. It's absolutely true. It is a truth that we tell over. It is a truth that as a family we find pride in. And I also have to be hearing that there are more layers to that truth that I knew, layers about American law and practice that I may not have been aware of. I have to be open to hearing that my family's truth is not everyone else's truth, and the factors that made it true for me and not true for everyone else are salient and important for me to understand. And I need to hear that multiple overlapping, maybe seemingly conflicting things can be true at the same time. That our American Jewish community can both have been the beneficiary of advantages in American society and also in some ways be vulnerable, maybe even more vulnerable than we felt 15 or 20 years ago. And out of that deeper, truer, more complex understanding, we can start to think about what it means to be who we are, a Jewish community in the United States of America, trying to understand and come to terms with our country's complicated, painful history and present when it comes to race.